video situations. Whoa. They, well, thanks again for everybody for coming through, making me feel hella popular. Right, like 4 introductions, you're like, man, who is that dude? Right, like, he coming with the fresh business, right? And let me personally thank the Sister Circle, because you are doing historically what Black women do, save lives, right? So I think it's important to recognize that and I got that from my guy, Chesaway Warren. He always says, he's like, look, Black women don't do what Black women do, save lives, right? So this thing around really being clear about that. I also want to acknowledge, right outside you all's walkway, there are a set of trees, or one tree in particular, with a hanging root on it, right? And in the Philippines, that type of tree is called a balete tree. And that tree is roots, the roots are exposed. And the message around those roots being exposed are, there is work to be done, and you must always remember who was here to first do that work. So here in Southeast Florida, I think it's important to name the names of the indigenous First Nations people whose bodies our souls and feet rest upon as we walk this land. So I want to acknowledge the First Nations people who are here and the kidnapped Africans whose bodies are still in this space, right? And when I see a balete tree, that is the first thing that reminds me, because throughout the Caribbean, balete trees are all throughout the Caribbean. And that's always the lesson there. So when Africans were kidnapped from the continent of Africa, it's always told in our stories that those trees were the reminders of our capacity to live despite extreme conditions. So this thing around, so being here is something that is important in that way. And I want to thank Delise, Andrea, Tracy for getting me here, because I'm usually uninvited, right? And based on my comments, you all will see why that happens, right? And the other thing, you know, for folks who came for a class, don't worry, it won't be as painful as you may think, right? Because I know sometimes when you come for a class, and the first thing you come to is like, man, who is this dude? Man, I'm already in this class. So let me go into this spot and figure this out. Now, one of the things that I am most concerned about throughout the country is we get caught into the panic moment. And the panic moment is always this one that does not allow us to actually name what is happening to us, right? So we all get caught up in Cheeto 45, right? If you all know who Cheeto 45 is, y'all can figure it out, right? He's the dude who looks like a Cheeto, and it's called the 45th President of the United States, right? And I just have to say that, so for all you Trump supporters, yo, you got what you paid for. You know, and I know saying that in Florida might mean something a little different. You know, y'all are right to carry state and everything else, right? So this thing around really being clear around what that means. Because now we have to come to grips with something. And every so often in America, we're reminded of it. But we forget it just as quick. America is proving itself to be what it has always been. A country founded on wrongful land appropriation, kidnapping, genocide, and white supremacy. And when we don't say that, we further become victimized by it. Now, it's important for me to start off like that. Some folks looking like, oh shit. Because you gotta start like that. It's not, because I don't believe in this kind of developmental thing around, oh, I'm gonna be nice, and then if I'm nice, then they'll really hit a point. Hell with that. Let's start with what it is. If we don't actually engage this from what it is, we will be further manipulated by it. And we see one of those spaces of manipulation is what happens in school. And no, I'm making a difference between school and education, right? You all in Florida got this thing with signals, right? When I landed in Fort Lauderdale and I walked through the airport, First thing it said was, welcome to Broward County. I was like, damn, is this Fort Lauderdale? It was like, nah, Broward, homie. Get your mind right. Right? And it's the same thing if I was in Dade County, it's the same thing. It's like, welcome to, and sometimes they might say Miami-Dade, but it's like Dade. Right? And then you all have Palm Beach County not too far away. So this thing around how those spaces come into being and who are the young folks in those spaces and who are the young folks who have been historically marginalized in those spaces. We cannot have a conversation about urban public education in the United States without an explicit understanding of white supremacy. Now, here's what I mean by that, because we reduce, again, the panic moment gets us. The panic moment gets us to Charlottesville, right? We think about a bunch of dudes with Confederate flags with burning crosses. White supremacy is more insidious than that. That's one part of it, right? So and that form is white racial terror, right? But white supremacy is more insidious. We need to understand it structurally. We need to understand it systemically. So when I refer to white supremacy, I am explicitly talking about the presumed views and values of white Western European, heterosexual, Christian, able-bodied, cisgendered males as normal, right, and good. And everything else has been othered. It has been made strange. It has been made the target of attack. And people have resisted. People have fought back. And we still live in this panic moment because there's the tragedy of the death. But what we haven't asked the question about is what got us to the death. And what got us to the death and the framing of that death as normal, right, and good. Or something that was supposed to be done. Right? So when we see this thing around police death, one of the things that we actually have to come to grips with is how that analysis is gendered. Right? Because as Black and Latino men have been killed by way of police interactions, we have totally ignored Black women and Latino women who have been killed under the same instances. And the public rationale is that that thing is normal, right, and good. That the Black body is criminal before it is human. So now, when we come to grips with that, we have some things that we need to deal with. And the question becomes, how do we now talk about this in places that are supposed to be safe? Nice. That always kills me about school. We just want it to be nice. Ain't shit nice about white supremacy. There is not a damn thing nice about coming into a space where you are perpetually being dehumanized. There is nothing nice about a space that always has a question around why you are there. So every time I see a young blood in the office, first thing I say is, me too. Right? Anytime, especially with little ones, right? When I see them, I just want to walk up to them and be like, man, you know this is bullshit, right? But we ain't here. The thing is, survive the encounter, stay alive. To a 5th grader. Right? Because this thing is around, so when we talk about education, this thing is around life or death. And a place that is probably more predicated around your death than your life. So now, how do we actually start to shift and transform what we know about this thing? Right? Because here's the thing. In school, there's this difference between the school and education. The question becomes, can education happen in school? Right? Because school is this order and compliance. We see it all the time. How many of y'all, by a show of hands, had a homie in school who just got through it by saying nothing? Because you figure it out. You're like, damn, if I say something, we know what's going to happen. I get sent to the office, then my mama got to come, then we might be in here longer than I need to, and they already messing with me. Right? And much of what we get in school is practically irrelevant to our lives. So some of y'all are like, well, shit, why are we here? Right? And I think that's a question that we should be asking. Because what is it that is connected to our lives? What is it that is allowing us to make sense of things that don't make any sense, but under white supremacy, make very clear sense? Because it is doing what it is always intended to do. Marginalize, isolate, and then trick you into believing that it's your fault. Right? And this becomes the end around how do we break this? How do we make this make sense in extremely difficult times? And not that this current Cheeto 45 moment is more difficult than what it has been in the United States, but actually understanding it as a continuum. This thing has always been a challenge. We just fool ourselves around sometimes we're better than others. Right? My grandmother passed away this summer at 100. Right? Her son, my father, just turned 77. The first thing he always says about school is like, hey man, look, like, my name is David, but until I was like 3, I thought my name was Hay. Right? Or Youngblood. Right? So his line of me is always, well, let me tell you something, man. Look, anytime an old head like me is talking about, well, back in my day, things were better, they were not paying attention. He said they're probably lying, and they're probably lying to manipulate you into being in that space. What are you going to do? I was like, damn. It's 8 o'clock in the morning, Bob. I wasn't even ready for that. He was like, look, man, knowledge, and his thing is, knowledge comes when knowledge comes. Take it how you get it, right? I'm like, damn, right? So this thing around how do we understand this? And in a city like Chicago, what are the parallels to what you all are experiencing here in Palm Beach County, Broward County, Dade County, your respective locales throughout the state of Florida? Because these things are not something that are separate. They're part of this entire thing around who is determined to be worthy of education and who gets school. And I would argue that many of us have just gotten school. Many of us can remember those days in school, and you say, so in addition to being a college professor, I teach a class with one of my former undergraduate students. And in that class, some of our high schools are just like, man, Stovall, why we gotta do this? I'm like, that's a good question. Let's start there. Is it connected to your life? Or is it some mandate from the state that we know has nothing to do with anything? Let's put it forward. Let's engage it. And in creating a school, and this is the thing around universities, right? Because, you come to universities, and I remember, when I was walking on campus today, I thought about myself as an 18-year-old. And I said to myself, like, what would I be doing in Southeast Florida as an 18-year-old? And I was like, Right? I would be running down whatever the street this is y'all have here, I'll just be running. Right? Trying to kick it. What y'all doing? Like, we're not going to class. What? Come on, man. Look. It's 70 degrees outside. I was like, man, I probably wouldn't make it past the first semester. So it was good that I went to a place that was cold, dreary, and all this other stuff. Right? So this thing around what we haven't come to grips with is that universities have a particular colonial relationship to their surrounding communities, right? And we haven't talked about that. The relationship that universities usually have to communities is one of exploitation, right? When you look around, if I were to walk here in Southeast Florida, if I were to walk around FAU, I would know that the majority of folks who work here live here. Now, the piece is, are those folks valued, and in what ways are they valued? Or are they just thought of as replaceable, disposable labor? And these are questions that we have to ask, because research institutions take this further. They'll actually go into spaces and they will exploit communities, tell you that they're actually doing work to benefit you. but what they're only doing is fulfilling a grant obligation. Now, we call that helicopter research, right? You come down, say you're gonna do a little something, don't do anything, don't even provide resources for that space that you're working in, and then leave. It is the classic colonial relationship, right? That the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico pointed out to folks, but nobody wanted to hear her. She said we are only being treated like this because we are reminded how Puerto Rico is still a colony. So, for anybody who's doing post-colonial studies, I don't know if we're post yet. So now when we start to think about this in relationship to schools, what does it mean now when researchers come into places to say that they're going to do work to benefit folks? Because most of the time they don't. And if anybody listens to the health professions, you'll see it's an interesting thing, especially being here in South Florida. If folks study the development of the birth control pill, it's a very interesting relationship, particularly with Puerto Rican women, right? Puerto Rican women were unlawfully sterilized in Puerto Rico to develop the birth control pill as part of research. Black women were sterilized throughout the South to actually get into population control. When we talk about Margaret Sanger, we actually don't get into who Margaret Sanger was. We associate her first with Planned Parenthood, but Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist who believed in population control. Now, that doesn't mean the history books. It's not nice. It's not friendly enough, right? Because now reproductive justice is situated in that, when reproductive justice is a totally different thing. It's people being able to take control of something as opposed to having it exploited. So when the same thing happens in school, we have to be very clear about that relationship. So the work that I do is trying to interrupt that historic colonial relationship that universities have had with their neighboring communities, right? So UIC, where I teach, and then in the 90s, they were doing experiments, again, on Puerto Rican women without consent forms, right? Poisoning their liver. So now when you see that, the question becomes, what does it mean in a different space, right? So I refer to this thing as the politics of interruption because we can no longer be fearful of the things that marginalize us. We are always, and when we get caught into that fear, nothing ever happens. Nothing will change. So now if we look to history, there have been people who have been willing to speak back on that fear. And in Chicago, we handle fear in a very different way, right? So every time I come to other cities across the country, I'm so surprised at the way your government operates. Because in Chicago, we don't have mayors. We have kings, right? And that king rules with an iron fist. And when you talk to folks in power, sometimes, and people would always say, Stovall, you're so extreme. I was like, look, man, anytime I'm talking to somebody from the city of Chicago in the mayor's office, the first thing I say to them is, look, I understand this conversation is probably being taped. I also understand that this conversation could mean my death. But let me tell you something if you try to kill me. I need you to chop me up and spread my body parts across the city. Because if you don't, I'm going to be back here tomorrow. Right? And everybody's just like, oh, you own one. No, I know how these people operate. Right? And you don't, and even when I'm in the room with them, and this is folks from, and no shade to people who work in central office of school districts, because when you talk to CPS, you walk out the door backwards, because if you turn your head, your brains might be blown out. So we talk about violence on the streets of Chicago. One of the most violent places is the office of the mayor. So now we think about this in a particular way. What does it mean when you're trying to claim a space for folks to be educated on their own terms? And this is what school districts fear, because the terms of the community will not be the terms of the district. Because in terms of the community, we'll say, we need things that are relevant. We need things that make sense. We need things that are connected to our lives because school has not been a place that has actually affirmed us. So now, how do we build one? Right? And in Chicago, I was working with a group of folks who had done a number of formations in housing, in youth work, and in school-based work. And I got a call one day from one of my good friends. Her name is Carolina Gallete. She's a Chilean woman whose family was ousted under the Pinochet government. And she gave me a call one day and she said, look, Stovall, meet me on the corner of 31st and Costner. Click. You know, and in Chicago, when you get the call, you got to meet the call. So where you going? 31st and Costner. It's not even it's not a question about that, right? So I get to the corner of 31st and Costner, and it's like me and 4 other people. And there's a TV truck. And I'm talking to the homies. I'm like, man, did y'all get a call to come here on the corner? They was like, yeah, bro. And we all looking at each other like, where everybody at? We looking down. And then we hear this grouping of people who are coming down both sides of the street. Right? They had blocked. So in Chicago, we don't necessarily believe in permits to protest. Right? So if we gonna do our thing, we gonna do our thing. Right? So it was literally 250 people walking down both sides of the street. They had a banner, and then they came and met us. We was like, oh, this is what it is. Right? So I was in day 5. I came on day 5 of a 19-day hunger strike. And before the hunger strike, the mayor, at that time, Richard J. Daley, who was the second king of the Daley family, who almost ruled Chicago for 45 years. All right? So Daley in 1997 promised that community that he would build a school on that land, right? It was the corner of 31st and Costner. It used to be a paint factory. And when he said that, between 1997 and 2001, they had built 4 other selective enrollment schools in Chicago instead of the school that he promised first. Now, give you all a sense of selective enrollment schools. Here in Florida, you all have magnet schools and what have you, so you got to have a high test score to actually apply or get in. In Chicago, it's a little different. You have to have a test score to even take the test to get in. So now, with the 5 of the selective enrollment schools in Chicago, it is easier to become a freshman at Harvard to be admitted to those schools. All right? So to give you a sense of what this thing is, right? So the community said, wait, these 4 schools were built, what happened to ours? So they got, and I love the way folks thought about this, right? So they were saying, well, let's pull one on the district, see what these folks are talking about. So if you came to Chicago, every month there is a Board of Education meeting. And they have a community session where you can sign up. Community members talk for, you get 2 minutes. So they said, a group of these community members said, all right, we're going to do something different with our 2 minutes. They brought a mariachi band, right? Full mariachi gear, everything, right? Trumpets, guitars, the whole piece. They come to the mic and they sing a song. The song is called Donde la Escuela, right? Where's our school? Right? And I always make fun of like, look, it should have been Donde la Escuela, quit playing. Right? So they sing Donde la Escuela. And it's funny because the board members don't know what's happening because nobody speaks Spanish. Right? So they just kind of, right? And then one person is looking like, do you know what they're saying? And it was one dude who knew what they were saying. He was trying to keep it together. He was like, look, you know, the funds had dried up to build the school. They're like, that's unacceptable. So what they actually do, they come back the next month. So just like you all are set up in rows, they brought chains in and they chained themselves to the back of the seats. Right? Cops came in, cut the chains, arrested everybody. Right? So they said, all right, look, here's what we need to do. We need to bring international attention to this. So right before I came to the corner of 31st and Costner, I got an email from one of my homies in Korea. And she was like, damn, Stovall, y'all doing, y'all hunger striking? It's serious out in the shop. It's like, hey, look, folks get down how they need to get down, right? And this thing now becomes an issue. Now, there's a couple of political movements that happened during this time. Some of you all may have heard of a guy named Paul Vallis. Paul Vallis is an interesting guy. He used to be the mayor's chief of staff, and then he became the chief executive officer of Chicago Public Schools. Now, it's important to put this in context. Chicago Public Schools does not have a superintendent. It has a CEO, right? So it's been corporatized and financialized, right? What you all are trying to do in Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County, right? So Chicago is one up on this. So now, Paul Vallis looked at him being head of Chicago Public Schools as a launching pad for him to run for governor. So he left the CEO-ship, and then our good friend Arne Duncan replaced him. Arne Duncan didn't want the bad publicity, and he decided, and he came to Camp Chavez, so Arne Duncan came to 31st and Constantine in the middle of the night. And he said, all right, look, y'all gonna have school. Because the hunger strikers at that time, the oldest one was 77, and the youngest one was 16. So he didn't want that publicity. Nobody wants to see a starving grandmother trying to get a school. So he's like, look, we'll find the money, you all got a school. And also during that time, Paul Vallis loses the governor's race. He goes to Philly, he leaves Philly, he goes to New Orleans right after Hurricane Katrina. And then he goes to Chile and Haiti. So Naomi Klein talks about a disaster capitalism. And one of the things that happens in disaster capitalism is that now private corporations actually come in to support infrastructure. So Paul Vallis teamed up with a group of folks called the Boston Consulting Group. And they hit New Orleans, and now New Orleans has 7 public schools left. The entire district has been chartered. In Philly, they have closed almost 50 schools. And in Haiti and Chile, they were trying to implement vouchers for folks to actually attend schools. What you all are trying to do here in Florida under Rick Scott. Right? So these things are connected. So when Duncan comes into the middle of the night and he says, all right, y'all gonna get to school, about a year later, two of the same homie who called me up, meet me on the corner of 31st and Costner, she was like, we at the house. So we were at her kitchen table. And she literally said to me, look, bro, we got a school. And in my head, I like totally transformed into a 3rd grader. I was like, oh, what? We about to do it, right? And thinking about, so we set ourselves up into design teams. But the school is also a beacon of the community in a number of different ways. And architecture becomes important in this because architecture are the signs that make us recognize where it is that we're in. So to give you all an example, if you came to the school right now, the school isn't on 90-degree angles. The school is shifted, it's on a 19-degree angle. You can only see it from on top. That 19-degree angle represents the 19 days of the hunger strike. If you look to the right, there are 14 trees. Those 14 trees were the 14 people who went the 19 days on the hunger strike. There's a sundial in the middle of the school. So when the hunger strike, I was like, man, architecture is heavy. I was like, damn, this is like a magic trick, right? So there's a cone in the middle of the school. And in May, every year, there's a beam of light that comes into the cone. And it goes around for 19 days. And on the 19th day, if it's clear outside, there's a beam of light that comes right through the middle. I was like, is this magic? And one day, me and one of the homies, we go right back to my 3rd grade mind. We was like, oh, right? Because we saw the beam of light. But this thing, and there are 4 schools in the building. So think about a building just like this, and there are 4 separate hallways, 2 floors apiece. So the dream of the community was to have a school of performing arts, a school of world languages, a school of math, science, and technology, and then a school of social justice to remind the community of the struggle it took to create that space. Right? So I was on the design team for the social justice high school. So when we got together, you talking about in our 3rd grade minds, I was like, yo, social justice high school. And we were talking like 3rd graders when we were talking about what we were going to put in the school. We was like, look, this is what we're going to do, right? You know our 3rd graders talking like, look, boom, 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 this is going to happen, All right. When you come into the school, it's going to be a trail of blood. What? Yes. Dude, look. Then the trail of blood is going to go down the hall, and we're going to call that the Ho Chi Minh Trail. What? It's the coldest, look. And then the trail of blood is going to go into the basketball court. And in the basketball court, it's going to be like 2 arms locked with machetes in both arms, right? And then the blood is going to drip down from the middle of the fist, and then it's going to be, in the blood, it's going to say, the macheteros. Yes, right? You're going to come in the building, you're going to see like Harriet Tubman, Cesar Chavez. Bro, we're going to have like, one of my guys like, look, we're going to put an AK-47 on the wall, and it's going to say, freedom. What? Look, we our 5th grade, little 3rd grade boys, they talking like, what is the coldest? And look, we yelling, it was almost like a Drake video, right? We yelling, we like, oh, this is the coldest, right? And then one of my homegirls walks in the room, she says, you all do remember that this is Chicago Public Schools. So that dream of the macheteros might not happen. We was like, dang, right? We was juiced, boy. We were like, man. And I was dreaming about that for like weeks. I was like, man, I was telling my partner, I was like, look, we're going to have the coldest school in life, right? Everybody will come through, take pictures of the whole thing. And all I wanted was a pair of basketball shorts with a machete on it. Yes, right? And the idea was so some of you all have read a psychiatrist from Martinique by the name of Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon talks about decolonization as upsetting, as unsettling, right? It's for the colonizer to know that his way of life is no longer accepted. But in decolonization, we can't say that the foot that's on our neck is one that we're just going to move off gradually. Frantz Fanon challenges us, when does it become time for us to sever the foot? Right now, I don't know if that went off too good with parents in the first days of the school, but this thing around how we actually look into this space becomes important because there's another thing that happens. Anytime a community has put forward an effort to create something, the violence that that community is met with from the powers that be is just as powerful. And I think that becomes important because CPS, Chicago Public Schools, did a couple of things that proved that they wanted us to know, even though you won this school, we are still in control. Right? And we fought that. And we still fight that to this day. And one of the things that comes in that process is in 2010, our budget got cut by almost 25%. We lost 6 teachers, and some of the programs that we were doing were unable to continue on. And those were huge losses. And then in 2011, and then I should also say, our principal died 3 times. That sounds crazy. Y'all like, who is this, Jesus? No. But literally, he had a heart ailment. And he flatlined 3 times. Right? And it was just the level of stress that he was engaging. Right? And then in CPS, in the city of Chicago, you all don't do this in Southeast Florida. But in the city of Chicago, if you are a teacher, a firefighter, a police officer, or a city worker, you cannot live outside of the city boundaries. Now, the reason why they did that was to secure a tax base. So to make sure that you have a consistent tax base in the city. So the principal, he had a son who was born with Down syndrome, and him and his partner moved to a neighboring suburb that actually had services for him. CPS found out, removed him instantly. Now, the other thing about that, in a city ruled by kings, those rules are loosely enforced. There are hella people in Chicago who live in the suburbs who teach in the city. The thing is whether or not they want to enforce it. So he gets fired, our assistant principal steps up, we got a nice rhythm, then our budget gets cut. Then we start the 2011 school year, and I was in Minnesota, and I get a text from one of my homies, and he says, look, the principal just came in the faculty meeting today and left. I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, man. He came in and said, I hate this job, I'm gone. So, whoa, social justice. Thanks so much. Right? Then we get, by the grace of all good energy, one of the most beautiful people I have ever met. This woman came in and was our principal. She told us this story. She said, I'm a first-generation immigrant from Monterrey, Mexico. My first teacher in Chicago public schools was a black woman who committed to teaching me English. So she said, what you all have here is my dream fulfilled. It is, because our school's about 70%, at that time it was about 70% Latino, about 30% black. And what she says is, and she goes around and she does this stuff. I mean, the way she understood relationships was something like I have never seen. Because her thing was, look, you're not going to get anything done in a classroom if the young people don't know that they are loved. So it just won't happen, right? So you say you can push all that critical, whatever, post-colonial, critical race, whatever you want to do. Yeah, that's cute. But if a young person doesn't feel as if they're loved, you have lost them, right? Because this is a place that has historically not loved them. I was like, whoa. Right? And CPS got slick with us too because she could only stay at the school temporarily because she had retired from another school, so she couldn't stay at ours because they would accuse her of double dipping, right? Getting a pension and a full principal salary. So she had to leave. So we were devastated. So then we opened up the search for a principal. And again, in a bureaucratic city like Chicago, one of the things that you have to have is you have to be principal eligible. This is all that means. You have to go in front of a panel and prove that you won't burn CPS down. That's all it is, right? So none of our homies would be principal eligible, right? So we had to pick from the list of people who were principal eligible. And it came down to a black woman and a Latina. And a community member came into one of the meetings and said, look, I need you to understand something. The person that you think is on your side is not. I have seen her in other spaces. I need you to take me seriously. And this was a long-term community member who had done all this work around food justice. So folks trusted him. When we get into the meeting and the vote, it's time for the vote. Remember, there are 4 hunger strikers who are on the principal selection committee called the local school council. They're community members, they're teachers, and there's a student. I have to say to the selection committee, look, if you hire the person that you think now has your back, the school will close in less than 6 months. Because CPS does this thing. Well, they'll put folks into schools with the intent to destroy them. Right? We call them hatchet people. Right? They'll come into the school, destroy the school, so another group of folks can swoop in and do something else. So And I told the selection committee about that process. I said, look, that thing is not, it's not if it's going to happen, it is when it's going to happen. Everybody made their vote. The vote came back 6-5 for the black woman. And to this day, my relationship with a couple of the hunger strikers is not good. Because they saw that one woman as the person who had their back. She humanized them through language, but she didn't understand what the school was about. And you have to make those tough decisions. Because one of the things in justice decision work, you got to make tough decisions. A lot of times you can read a book and it looks like this linear thing, right? You did this and then this happened. That is not the case. We're talking about hard work that's going to challenge who you are and how you move in the world. Right? I would come home some days, some of you all have had this experience, and then my father cracked a joke. He said, oh, young blood, that just means that you was working hard. I was literally standing in my kitchen, and I'm looking at something coming from my face that's dropping on the floor. I could not feel, I was so tired, I could not feel myself crying. I was leaking, face just leaking. Right? And I'm saying to myself, this is what this means, right? So then we get our school year going. I get another call from one of the homies. She said, man, 2 security guards came to school, brought a box to the principal's desk, told her she needs to fill that box in 45 minutes and she has to leave the building. 2 days before the first day of school. I was like, so, a lot of times I want people to leave today like, damn, it's a conspiracy. It's a lot simpler than that. It's public policy. If they don't want you, they will move to get you. Right? So they came in, 2 security guards. They told her they had 38s on their side. It was like, look, you can put your stuff in this box. You got 45 minutes to leave the building. A week later, they did the same thing to 2 of our founding teachers. And they wouldn't tell us why they fired them or removed them. We're like, wait, what's happening here? Oh, they said, oh, I see, this is what's happening. They couldn't get their bad person in to destroy the school from the inside, so now they're going to use an external strategy. So we had this community forming, and our students are thinking about this in rapid ways. So literally, when the principal got fired, they came to school that Monday, that Tuesday. They had already put a YouTube video up with them having a sit-in in the hallway. And all the caption says is, ain't nobody going to class today. And I was like, dang. Right? The day after that, they marching around the block. And all I'm saying is like, man. All I'm thinking in my head is like, we have taught them well. Right? They march around like, ain't nobody going to school today. It was like, Stovall, I remember driving up there, it was like, Stovall, we ain't going to today. And I was like, man, for real? I was like, no. I was like, how long are you going to stay out? As long as we need to. I was like, oh, right? And these are juniors and seniors, they got college applications on it. It was like, look, we'll take care of that. It's like, you teach out of college? that's that 17 and 18-year-old mind working, right? They was like, look, we gonna make that make sense. Right? So now they get into this space. So from August to November, we have all these community forums. And in one of the community forums, CPS thought they were being slick. So they show us this data and they say, well, your data has increased over the last 3 years. I said, well, wait, our principal has just been removed. Now, I need you to do something. This is me talking to the district. I said, I need you all to do something. I need you to explain this to me, not as someone who doesn't know what you're talking about. I need you to explain this to me as someone who studies what you do for a living. That's how that whole conversation sounded out there, right? Then they got some person to sneak around me and like give me a card. If you want to talk about this, I don't need to talk about that. We're going to talk about this right here, right? Because what y'all got to deal with is 350 in this room. It's 11 of y'all. We winning that one all day. So y'all figure that out, right? So then after more and more meetings, and me and the students started to nickname those meetings chocolate sprinkles. Now, all chocolate sprinkles was somebody defecating on your head telling you that it's chocolate sprinkles, right? So, because they would tell us all this madness in the meeting, and one time one of the students just yelled, "This is chocolate sprinkles!" And everybody just kind of looks like, right? And after we talked to them, I was like, yes, this was all chocolate sprinkles, right? And then in November, there was the CEO was a guy named Jean-Claude Brizard, and he came back and he rehired our principal. He also rehired our 2 founding teachers. And in 2013, in the graduation, there was a guy named Danny Morales-Doyle, who is one of the science teachers. And they picked him to be the graduation speaker. And he said to me what I thought to be one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. He said, "There's a beautiful day today. You all have finished what we thought you would finish. There will be another beautiful day. And I cannot wait to see you in 10 years when we are still fighting to keep this school open." I was like, damn. If you want a graduation address, that's how you do it, right? So this thing is always, the thing that we get is that this struggle is in perpetuity. And what I mean by that is you are always fighting, right? And another thing is, it is never about if the naysayers are coming. If you are making a demand towards justice, it is always when they are coming. You must be prepared. So I crack a joke with my students, with my high school students. I'm like, look, when the feds come, just remember we on page 48. Right? So if they scoop me and I'm going for 3 hours, more than 3 hours, y'all know who to call. We good? Oh, it's good. You know, and it's funny when people come to visit the classroom, students are always like, "Is that them?" Like, "So are you good? Do we need to get down? What's good? Let us know what's cracking." Right? So this thing around now, how do we now start to make this make sense as an interruption to the colonial relationship that university researchers have had to community spaces? What is our responsibility to the places that actually are doing the real work? And what are the challenges therein? Where are the failures? How do we confront those failures? How do we get back up when our heads are busted? And this way, and so again, so when people talk about theory, I know some of you all in education classes, we theory the hell out of y'all, right? But the question is, what does it mean on the ground, right? And there's a guy named Eric Yamamoto who does this thing called critical race praxis. And he says, look, we need to spend less time with abstract theorizing and more time on the ground with people who are experiencing the injustice, right? Because at any given moment, it could be us, right? And if we're not careful, it will be us. So now he says there's 4 things that you need to do. First, you have to think about this conceptually. What is it that you're trying to do, right? Some people refer to it as a mission and vision, right? But what are you trying to do, right? Second, you have to think about it in terms of materially. What are the resources that you need to enact this vision, right? The third space, you have to think about this performatively, right? So what are you doing in that space in the day-to-day, right? So now we always ask this question around pedagogy, right? But what is that pedagogy, right? How are you performing and enacting that pedagogy daily? And then the fourth thing, which brings all 3 of those things together, is how do we think about this reflexively, right? So now we have to think about what it is that we are doing, what went well, what did not go well, and what are we willing to do to improve it? And that's a difficult practice because we realize the first thing you realize with that as a teacher or administrator is that the students are not at fault. That's on you, right? We were talking driving up today, like some of you all who may remember your first year's teaching. The first year of teaching is like psychic violence, right? Like your first year teaching, it's like you just got popped in the lip, right? First day, ooh, damn, what just happened, right? And it's not the fact of anything with the students, it's just that you're really bad. That's all it is. And the young bloods have little patience, right? You know, young people, that's why I like young folks. Young folks have the smallest bullshit meter ever. They're going to tell you straight up, this is not working, Stovall. You got to get your mind right. Right? They have a nickname for me in class. They call me low tech. So I don't have like, oh, this is like super saucy to me, right? I just got like a dry erase marker and I'm just going in like, hey, look, this is what it is, right? It's like, so have you committed, like one of my students asked me a couple years ago, it's like, have you just committed your life to always being in trouble? And I was like, you know, I have never thought about this, but I guess so. She was like, you always own one. Like, they gonna get you. And I was like, look, and she was like, I'm young, I can't do nothing. It's like, I ain't got enough money, right? And I was like, no, don't worry about it, we'll be all good. So this thing around how we come into knowing these spaces are deeply around how we understand them and what we're doing to improve them. And that, I would argue, gets us away from school and more into education. A much more difficult process, but one that we have to engage, and one that we cannot be fearful of. Because when we are fearful of it, the powers that be will control what we do. And the piece is, how are we committed to sever the foot that keeps us down? Right? And I say that because that imagery becomes important, because we justify this stuff and we think that Betty DeVos is aberration. Betty DeVos is just a continuation of what this place has always tried to do in public schools. Right? And Rick Scott right here in Florida just says, and that's what we want. Right? So now you all are dealing with potential vouchers. You all are already a right to work state. You all already get a particular, you have these rubrics that now will allow you to close schools. So this thing is universal. Our experiences are shared just under different groups of people. And I say this to you all not as an expert, but someone who is also a struggling educator, right? I know there are many days where things do not go well or right, but I have to be committed to that, right? And our work, I believe, starts there. And when we look at that, something like critical race praxis, it's nothing new, but just a reminder of the work to be done. Now, let me check in with y'all. Is this making sense? All right? Now, I've run my mouth probably hella too long, but let's stop there. Thank y'all again for having me, and hopefully this is making sense. Yeah? And I know folks wanted to engage in some Q&A, because I know, like I said, people talking at you and all this stuff. I mean, a lot of times there are ideas that are brewing that may be of use to folks. So if there are any questions, let's get into it. Oh, yes, sir.
Yeah, the part about the science teacher, graduation students, that really struck with me. And my question was, because you addressed kind of the struggle you were doing, and just listening to you, you know, is there a realization that it's always going to be an adversarial relationship? And isn't that kind of getting into the problem, rather than kind of taking a different perspective, like maybe I can work with the person who's my writer?
Right, and this thing around, it's a question of strategy, because it's an important piece, right? But I think this thing around this, allies are only proven, right? And what do I mean by that? Because, you know, in academia, just use the academic example, we talk hella much, but when it comes time to do some work, folks are like, I was just playing, right? So this thing around really going into that, because I am all for someone infiltrating that space, right? But if they infiltrate that space, there are a couple of terms and conditions that I think that are important. One, they cannot go on a solo long ranger mission because they will be killed instantly, right? And if they do go, they have to go collectively, and they have to go collectively with a vision and an accountability loop to the people they say they care about. And in our conversations, that is where our conversations will start. What is the accountability to these spaces that have been historically marginalized, and then that marginalization is now deemed to be normal, right? So we got this mayoral race, and we in Chicago, and we got this guy who's running, who's like a real solid education dude, right? If he wins this thing, Chicago just might get rid of all standardized testing. That's how hard he goes, right? And he could potentially win this thing. So now the question becomes, in his accountability to the people that he cares about, who does he now build out to be in the Department of Education in Chicago Public Schools? Right? So it's a strategy thing, because it's not so much, because a lot of times people just reduce activism to protest, right? And folks who are doing work on the ground always say the real work is done between the protests, right? So now we always have to think about, because the protest is just to bring attention. Now you have to do the real work, right? So I think that always becomes the question, because a lot of times people try to quell the protest, but the lesson from the Black Freedom Movement was, look, that's just one part of it. The real piece is us meeting at each other's kitchen tables, figuring out the next strategies, right? And that stuff goes unspoken, right? Give you all a classic example of this. How many folks know who Claudette Colvin is? Has anybody heard of it? Some folks have heard her name? And a couple of folks heard. And just as an example, Claudette Colvin was actually the first person who participated in the Montgomery bus boycott. She was 16 years old and pregnant. The powers that be, under respectability politics, didn't want the face of the protest to be a pregnant Black girl. Right? So now we have to think about all those particular things, right? So now, when we start to think about that, now, under a radical imaginary, the question is always, we are never asking the question as how you come to the party. You are here, we gotta work. Right? And I think that becomes important. And I've actually, to your point, I've learned a lot over the last 3 years from the transgender community, right? Around how, and, because, in community-based work, you always think about, holding people accountable. And some of my folks from the transgender community said, well, what does it mean to hold people in love? My head first was like, what you mean love? The struggle. Just the struggle. From the time I was 19 to like 36, right? Everything was for the struggle, right? If I was kicking it in the street, this is for the struggle. We kicking it for the struggle, right? Until you're just like, you looking kind of crazy, right? But this thing around how we now start to think about that, because my thing is, who will do that work? And I don't care how they come, I don't care what they look like, but this thing around how, because a lot of times we can get into what people refer to as a down politic. So who's down, right? But we never know who's down unless we're working with them, right? So now we have to engage it in that way. So I think it's just that question of strategy, but not always being antagonistic, but really understanding what those structures are intended to do, right? And how do we actually interrupt that? Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
As a Puerto Rican Hispanic woman, I'm not interested in the guinea-pigging of the educational system, and I have my career, but I'm still in the educational system as a student and a provider. I was just wondering, how do we get the younger generation into that love mode and engage mode to see what society is doing and get more transparency from government and the educational system so that they can change things?
Right. I think this thing around is two things in that, right? First, we have to show them love, right? And we got to be consistent in how we show them love. I think the second thing is actually shifting what are we actually talking about, right? All right, y'all, so anybody in K-8 education, these are two things that must be destroyed instantly. This Pioneer Day shit, that gotta go. That has to go. Right? I mean, what are we doing? I mean, what is that? Right? And how we talk about Columbus, that gotta go. That has to go. So this is the new kindergarten Columbus curriculum. Right now, 30 seconds. Fool went the wrong way, called people the wrong name, thought he was someplace else, brought all his homies to bring death and destruction. So now, if we ain't teaching Columbus Day like that, we got a problem. Right? So I think it's really around how we actually start to engage this content, right? What is of value? What have we thought about curriculum? You know, and for folks who do artists and pedagogy, we call it backwards mapping, right? But backwards mapping is just, and all that is going with the goal in terms of what you're trying to do. Well, what if we thought about, what if we asked young people what was important to them? Right? What if we just say that, right? What's important? What is important to y'all? And now, what has informed that thing that you find to be important? Right? So now how do we think? Because now you get into this understanding of how we get manipulated into excess. Right? Now we got to talk about the contradictions of capital. And then everybody's like, well, Stovall, we got third graders. Yes! Hell yeah, let's get third graders into a conversation about the contradiction of capital because they're experiencing it. Right? Lawrence Tan, teacher in Oakland, California, used to be in LA, he always says this thing. We always mess up with this thing around age appropriateness. If a young person is old enough to experience degradation, isolation, marginalization, and white supremacy, they are old enough to be told the truth. Period. Right? You got to start there. Right? And we can't be fearful of it. Right? Because now, when you engage that, the ops are coming. Right? And so now you have to be able to say, okay, here's where folks are going with this. Right? And here's why we need to engage this. Right? One of my good friends, Rico Gutstein, talked about the world economic crisis with third graders with cookies. I was like, yeah, that's what we on, homie. Right? So Patrick Kamayan talks about how do we understand dispossession? What has been taken from us? Right? One of the things that have been taken is our knowledge of ourselves. Yes. Right? So when that knowledge of self is taken from you, now you believe anything. Pioneer Day becomes truthful. So now what is the reclaiming? Right? Because what that does for young folks is they say, and let's think about it. How many of you all have had a good teacher? Right? And now think about it. Of all you all who have had good teachers, was that good teacher always in trouble? We don't have to go any further than that. Right? Because that good teacher was less concerned about school and much more concerned about education. But the thing is, we got to be clear about that because the thing is, I mean, young folks are being like, I'm 45, right? My high school seniors were born in 2001. Right? A lot of them weren't even born when September 11th happened. Right? They were 4 years old when Hurricane Katrina happened. So now I have to think about that in different ways, right? It's always the thing, and the gray hairs show it. You're like, damn. You know, like my old man always says this thing. He's like, look, man, I can guarantee you one thing in life. Everybody gets younger and you get older. Right? Because that's how it is. Like you ask your students, like, it freaked me out a couple years ago. It's like, when were you born? 2000? Oh, shit. Damn. Like, whoa. Right? I was in another part of the universe in my own thinking in 2000. Right? I mean, I graduated high school almost 30 years ago. Right? So I came in. So, and the easiest thing to turn off young people is this first quote. well, back in my day. Do not start with that. That is the worst thing you can say to young people, because they're always being castigated. Right? Young folks are always, they're fighting for space. Right? They're fighting for their humanity. Right? So if you come in, well, back in my day, when I had one shoe and a shovel, and I was walking from Hialeah all the way down to Miami-Dade, it's like, come on, man. Like, and why would they block that out? Right? Because it doesn't relate to them, and in a place that they're already being dehumanized in, they don't need further admonishment. Right? So, I mean, I think it's important for us to take that, right? Because now our content brings about the justice condition. Right? How we engage that brings about the justice condition. How we follow through with it brings the justice condition, right? And that's not an overnight process, right? I've been working with young folks and families for 25 years, and I still have epic fails, right? Some of y'all have that experience. You driving home and you're just like, ooh, that was awful. Right? Some days I have to go back to class. I got to go back the next day and be like, man, look, y'all, I got to apologize for yesterday. I was on one, right? So, I mean, but this thing around how, because that's just another example of our accountability, right? So it's not, because we place the weight on the wrong group of people, I would argue, right? So now saying, so it's not just placing the weight on them, but saying, how do we share that weight? And now in sharing that weight, here's what we do. Yes, ma'am.
They are, and I'm still learning this, trying to find a voice. I feel like I always had a voice, but I'm sure I did not. But at that stage, I feel like they're still trying to figure out, who I am. Can I say this without getting in trouble? Is mama gonna get me? So it's like, I want you to tell the truth and be comfortable with speaking the truth, your truth, or the truth, without feeling like this is the wrong space when it should be the right space.
Right. And thank you for that, because I think these are real questions at the parental level that we got to go into, right? And I think one of the things is first thinking about who's the teacher in that classroom, right? And now, is that teacher there just to fulfill some labor obligation, or to what extent are they actually challenging how we think and do, right? So now the other part is, and I think this is the big thing, because this is where the stress level kicks up. Because when you tell a young person to stand for the truth, they're going to do it.
Yes, they are.
And they're going to do it hard. They're going to go to the fullest. Right? They say, look, man, look, what? No, you're lying. Right? That's a lie. This is what we need to be talking about. Now, the piece is, how do we defend that? Right? And just realize that, so now, I think in our mental space, just preparing for not the if, but the when. Right? And it's a tougher thing to deal with, right? I won't lie about that. But that thing around, it's like, look, stand on this, right? Somebody has your back, right? You gotta show up, right? We have to do that, right? And that thing around it's not to frame it as antagonistic, but we've seen, some of you all have seen some of this stuff that's happening in classrooms. I mean, folks dressing up in slavery, nooses around necks. I mean, these are babies who are engaged in this, right? We ain't even got a conversation around what the convenience clause of the 13th Amendment is, especially with 13-year-olds, right? Think about their 7th, 8th graders, when their bodies now become criminalized, right? Because you got an 8th grader, I mean, look, let's put it all in the street. You got an 8th grader, 6'1", 190 pounds. that is no longer a youth in the eyes of some law enforcement. Right? That's the, and I'm sure here you all at FAU got those crime alerts. Who is the crime alert? What are we talking about? Look, let's just put it all out there. The crime alert. Black male, Latino male, between 5'6" and 6'8". Right? 120 to 340 pounds. Who is that? Right? So I always talk about at UIC, it's like, look, I am the crime report. Right? Just in real time. Right? So this thing around now understanding that, right? Living in that truth, but now trusting our struggle to show up. Because what we also do, what we talk about in teaching all the time, modeling. Right? So this thing around, because the other thing is I've seen parents do this, and I like when I see it with students. It says, look, if somebody else is standing for the truth, don't leave them hanging. Right, that's a different space. So your homies, I said, and I've seen the little ones, right? One of your homies standing for the truth, stand with them, right? Even if it is you standing next to them. Right? And I was just like, man, and I saw this group of high schoolers do this. Like, man, I was like, damn, that is the dream, right? There was a young woman, she was struggling with reading this thing because it was a piece that was heavy, and she was worried that it wasn't gonna come out right. Her entire class got up, grabbed her by the arm, stood with her and said, "We're gonna get this." Damn, that is instruction. Right? I was like, man, I mean, like, there's no substitute for that, right? Because now you're able to do a couple of things. You're able to delineate when people are trying to manipulate you. And you've also demonstrated how you will stand collectively for this thing that will come for you in all these different ways. Yeah. And I think just to live in the truth of that allows us to think about it differently. What are other questions or a staring contest, whichever people prefer? Yes, sir.
I just want to throw an idea out and get your response. One of the things I've always believed is that those of us who are committed to equity must also understand that inequity has its beneficiaries.
Without question.
And that we often don't give that a whole lot of discussion. So for example, if society was segregated and less than stellar white students were getting into the University of Florida, because it was segregated, there's a constituency for that. I'm wondering if you could speak to that issue of the constituents of inequity.
Right. Thank you so much for this. And the first thing I thought about when you said it, how many of y'all have ever heard, I know y'all got it here at FAU, how many of y'all have heard of TRIO programs? Yeah. Well, folks know the history of TRIO is very interesting. Right? So TRIO is College Search, Upward Bound, and it's one more at all, Talent Search. Yeah. TRIO was originally developed for white students. Now, they never talk about this in terms of TRIO officers, right? Because we always think about it as the office that's working with students of color, what have you. But there's an excellent book about this. Charles Mills wrote a book called The Racial Contract. And in The Racial Contract, he talks about there are people who are not signatories to the contract, but they are beneficiaries of it. Right? And he talks about that in terms of contract. And he actually got that from a feminist named Carol Payton, who talked about she wrote a book called The Gender Contract. But this thing around how we look at that particular, so who actually benefits from those particular spaces, or who benefits from the inequity, right? And largely what we see as the folks who benefit from that inequity have actually done a couple of things. And another way that this thing comes out, so we don't think about, we think about Harvard in this very particular way. How many of you all have heard of a thing called legacy admissions? Right? Every university has a legacy admit question. So for people who are unfamiliar with this thing, it just says, do you have an immediate relative who's a graduate of this university? As soon as you mark yes, you get a number of set of points in admission. What percentage of Harvard is legacy admit? Right? It's almost 85%. Right? So 85% of the people who have been admitted to Harvard have an immediate family member they graduated from. So now the question becomes, who gets kept out? Another example, and this is the thing, and this is why we're too damn nice in education. You do not get a profession to be 81% white women by accident. You just have to start there, right? So the question becomes, in terms of the beneficiaries of inequity, who is locked out, right? So now in Chicago, we're almost at a moment where we will have fewer teachers than we did before the Brown decision. Fewer black teachers, I should say. Right? So think about that, right? We're talking about a city that's 35% black, right? That had almost 8,000 black teachers, right? That now is hovering around 2,500, 3,000. Right? So this thing around how do we, and so the question to your point, how do we get to this moment, right? And who does that particular inequity benefit, right? It may, and it's the benefit is what lawyers refer to as a subtle benefit. Because what it actually does is just maintain the status quo, right? So all these things that we talk about, so Black Freedom Movement, Chicago Power, these were interruptions to the status quo. So now the push is always to return to the status quo, right? And then in this thing around, especially like here in Florida, like around Lake Okeechobee. Oh, is that it? I'm fucking it up. Okay. Okeechobee. Tripping. Right? That's the worst thing. That's the worst thing you can do. Come to somebody's house and use the wrong name. Right? But that particular area is poor, rural, and white. Right? When you look at the schools in those spaces, they've been disinvested. But when you go to that spot, if you're a person of color, it might be one of the most dangerous spaces that you've entered. But what they haven't put together is just like in Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach, their schools are actually being disinvested at the same rate. But because of our inability or our manipulation, we can't put that together. And when we don't put that together, now you have a perfect group to pit against those who are demanding the justice. You got a perfect gentry that will do your bidding. Right? So this thing around how folks now become victimized even as beneficiaries of that racialized contract. Right? And this thing around really putting that together, and when we don't have that conversation, we go back to these assumptions that are quite dangerous, right? Like, this stuff, we've actually had data on this since the late 80s. Who have been the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action policies? White women. I mean, we got 30 years of labor data that tells us this. But yet, this is the people who are castigated for quote unquote taking jobs really don't have access to them in the first place. Right? So this thing around really, and this just goes around a critical analysis, right? What happens, and this is the thing with high schools, back to your question, what happens when we're committed to go just that little step beneath the surface? To lift the veil on this, right? To talk about it differently, right? Because when we don't, we start to justify the same thing. right? So, and let me go back to 45 Cheeto. This is interesting, and this little data point freaked me out. I was like, oh, this is something that we need to pay attention to. What do you all think was the average household income of a Trump voter? This is interesting. Right? It's almost $80,000. So now when we look at this thing, it's like, no, that's not poor white folks. That's a whole gentry of folks who have engaged in what political scientists refer to as a replacement vote. Right? And a replacement vote is this thing, as long as it's not this thing, we're going to go in this direction. Right? So this thing around how we even, so when I saw that data point, I was like, whoa, that changes up the lens by how we actually understand this, right? And, in really understanding Trump, I think becomes important. We got to do more studies of like P.T. Barnum. You really, because that thing around distraction is huge, right? Because now I got you focused on a tweet. There are 42 federal judgeships positions that are open. Those federal positions shift how the law is interpreted. Right? We caught up on a tweet, right? And this stuff is just happening right under the surface, right? So now how do we use that lens? And P.T. Barnum said it best, right? It's a sucker born every minute. All you got to do is distract them and give them fantasy. The Apprentice, the gaudiness of Trump Towers. Right? It's pro forma. Like, you just see it like, oh, it's almost like an advertising firm wrote this. Right? So this thing around now, how do we, and the question is, what brings us back? What brings us to further consciousness around us, right? Because it's unsettling, right? It is unsettling. And we got to be honest about that. Unsettling. Well, thank y'all again. Hopefully it's making sense, right?